And usually by this point, a person's relationship with their parents has improved. Again, might not be perfect, there might still be conflict that comes and goes, but it's usually not as often or as intense. And since feeling accepted by your parents and having the approval of your parents contributes to self-esteem, this helps. And as an emerging adult, compared to being an adolescent, you really are truly beginning to separate from your parents, ideologically and often physically, as many go away to school or simply move out of their parents' home, which is naturally going to decrease the number of things you have to act on as a source of conflict. And a huge difference that contributes to increasing self-esteem, I think, that I don't think is recognized half as much as it should, is emerging adulthood means leaving high school. That age-graded place where you have to go every single day, usually with the same group of peers you have attended school with for years, so everybody knows everyone else, and everybody knows everyone else's history. I think the analogy of a fishbowl is very fitting. High school, where you are evaluated on a daily basis by your peers, and where you evaluate yourself daily in relation to your peers. For a lot of people, high school is not a happy experience. Instead, it's anywhere from completely miserable to simply not very happy. And that's an enormous spectrum. Now, it isn't that after high school, all of these issues with peers and friends and self-acceptance completely disappear. But once high school is done, your environment is much less restricted. You go to a bigger school or leave the place you grew up or you begin working. What all of this means is your environment becomes larger. You're no longer in that little fishbowl anymore, and you have more contact with a wider variety of people. And you don't have these direct daily comparisons that are as intense and direct either. So in emerging adulthood, peers and friends continue to be important, but not in the same intense manner as in adolescence. And also as a part of this more unrestricted environment, when you reach emerging adulthood, this usually means you have more control over the social context of your everyday life. You're more of an adult. You have more choice in how you spend your time, who you spend it with, and for how long. So you can spend more time with the people in the environments you like, and less time with the people you like less in environments you like less. You have more control over the social situations you find yourself in. Um, For example, people who are not very book smart, they're not academically inclined, you still have to attend school. Another way of looking at this is they're made to spend their days in a place where they know they're not going to be very successful, and as a result will experience a lot more stress. This is going to seriously, repeatedly undermine their self-esteem. But in emerging adulthood, they can leave school and instead engage in full-time work that they may find more gratifying and enjoyable. Now, they may continue their education, but not in a classroom environment. Maybe as an adolescent, you're forced to spend time with the kids of your parents' friends, even though you can't stand them. But as an emerging adult, you have more control over this. So let's continue then and look specifically at identity. And if you're talking about adolescence and identity, you got to talk about Erik Erikson. He is one of the most influential people when it comes to the study of adolescent development, specifically identity. And he led a pretty interesting life. He was a teacher, a psychoanalyst, an ethnographer who lived among First Nations people, and he was also a therapist for World War II veterans. So not only did he have a lot of experience directly, but it was quite varied. His theory of human development goes across the lifespan. However, our focus is adolescence, and adolescence is also where his focus was for the most part. In 1950, he published a book called Childhoods and Society. And what he said in this book was that each period of life is characterized by a distinct developmental issue or crisis. So he says every stage of life has a crisis that involves development. And each of these crises has the potential for a healthy outcome or an unhealthy outcome. So we're focusing on adolescence, and what Erikson said about adolescence is that the crisis that occurs here is what he called identity versus identity confusion. Now, before I even get into Erikson's exact definition of this, I want to point out that this is one of the few times a theorist has used a term for something that actually makes sense and isn't confusing. So good for him. If there is a positive outcome of this developmental crisis in adolescence of identity versus identity confusion, that means the young person establishes a clear sense of who they are. They come to a pretty clear, positive conclusion of who they are and how they kind of fit into the world. So, and if there's a negative outcome, well, then the opposite occurs. So, what does this mean and what does this involve? Because establishing a clear identity can mean different things to different people. Generally, a positive identity or a positive outcome of this developmental crisis means that on some level you think about your traits, your abilities, your interests, your personality, your characteristics, and you kind of shift through all the choices you have available to you, and you make an informed decision about what your identity is. In the textbook, it says that on some level, you're thinking about what your traits, abilities, and interests are, and then shift through the range of life choices available in your culture, trying out various possibilities and ultimately making commitments. That's the very academic way the textbook puts it. Put it my way, you figure out who you are. So you figure out in general who you are, where you fit into the grand scheme of things, and it either goes well or it doesn't. So ideally, what we want is for every adolescent who comes out of this stage to have a strong, stable sense of who they are. We want them to have a strong and stable sense of identity. That would be a positive outcome. And if that happens, well, then it means they're pretty well equipped to head into adulthood. But it's not a perfect world. Instead, most people, for most people, competently getting through this stage of development means just that. You don't come out with a great, super positive identity, but you're at least competent at a minimal level. And remember, if your identity formation isn't perfect, it doesn't mean you're confused, because having a stable identity may mean different things for different people. Now, Erikson says having a stable identity or successfully completing this identity crisis means that you work through aspects of love, work, and ideology. He says these are the key areas of identity. And of course, doesn't mean, okay, you get through this in adolescence, you get through it well, you're set for life. Identity issues arise over your entire life, and Erikson recognized that. And I can tell you, anybody well past the adolescent stage of life, anybody past the emerging adult stage of life would agree. If only we could come to a stable, clear identity and then be set for life, life would probably be much easier. So he said this continues to happen in your life. However, in adolescence, it's especially important. Now, this quote I've got here is a direct quote from Erikson, and it really summarizes what he's saying quite well. A sense of identity is never gained nor maintained once and for all. It's constantly lost and regained. So your identity is constantly shifting and evolving. But for Erikson, this is especially important in adolescence because he said that this is the central developmental issue of adolescence: identity versus identity confusion. And he took this further, and he even said that having a successful, at least a competent outcome from this developmental crisis is really important, because this is going to act in many ways as the basis of your identity for the rest of your adult life. He said, if you are able to establish a clear and stable identity in adolescence, so you get over this developmental hump, it's kind of like a stepping stone for furthering your identity. So think of it like putting in a foundation for a house. You need a clear, solid foundation for the support in your house. You can put in the most beautiful kitchen you want, spend thousands of dollars on it, but if you don't have that stable foundation, you're going to have a problem. And Erickson said that during adolescence, it's the same basic idea when it comes to establishing a clear identity. So, how does this work? I mean, how do you develop a healthy identity? It sounds like it'd be really complicated. And I guess in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't. From Erickson's point of view, he said the first key process to a positive identity formation is identifications. Essentially, who you identify with, who you feel an association with. Identifications are relationships that you form with people during your childhood where you have love for that person, and because of that, you want to be like them. So, for example, children might identify with their parents or teachers. They admire them and they want to be like them. So, maybe just to keep this straight in your head to make it easier to understand, if you're taking notes, write associations beside identifications. So, developing a clear identity in adolescence, at least in part, is dependent on a person's childhood relationships that they do or do not have. And when adolescence begins, adolescents generally reflect on their associations. They reflect on their identifications with people they have associated with up to that point, the loving relationships they have or have not had. And as a result, they embrace some and they reject others. They want to be like certain people and not like other people. Or maybe there's certain things they like about the same person and certain things they don't like about that person. So they want to be like their mom and dad in that they're very loving and supportive, but they don't want to be like them in that they drink a lot. So an adolescent reflects on these and they embrace some and reflect others. In a way, it's like other people, it's like the adolescent is modeling themselves after people they have been associated with. So identifications are part of the process of identity formation. Now, the other is psychosocial moratorium. And please don't let this term throw you because it sounds really complicated and it's not. First process of developing an identity is identifications. Second process of developing identity is putting adulthood on hold. That's all that psychosocial moratorium means. The word moratorium means a period of time when something is temporarily prohibited, it's delayed, it's paused. And that's what you're doing as an adolescent. A psychosocial moratorium just means a period of time when adult responsibilities are postponed, when you're trying things out as a young person to see who you want to be as an adult. So you date someone once or for a few months or for a few years, and then break up and date somebody else. And this contributes to your identity formation because doing this helps you get a clearer sense of yourself through your interaction with that person. You have friends who come into your life, and some you grow apart from, and some you have conflict with. This contributes to your identity. You have different jobs, sometimes various possible majors in college or university. And all of this is pretty much expected at this stage of life, isn't it? We as a whole view adolescence as a time for trying things on, trying different identities on. And sometimes in retrospect, this can be really embarrassing. You know, for my generation, the person who was a total goth kid in high school are really into grunge, or the really high teased, hairsprayed hair typical of the 80s. As an adult, you look back at your identity then and you cringe. Now, another part of this psychosocial moratorium, so we're still putting adulthood on pause, we're trying stuff out. It might involve ideological exploration, which sounds complicated, but it's not. Sounds really philosophical. And I don't mean that an adolescent is sitting there thinking, what is my ideology? What do I believe in? But it does figure out, for example, it does include, for example, figuring out what your religious beliefs are apart from your family. Sex before marriage, living with someone before marriage, is attending a religious service every week that you were made to do by your parents something you consider necessary apart from them, or following other religious rituals or norms you were raised with. Psychosocial moratorium might include political beliefs, Gun control is a great example of this, one in which young people have really become directly involved with due to school shootings in the United States, trying to change the laws and legislation, or government attitude toward immigrants, or the continued debate regarding abortion and right to life in the United States. So this is something that usually tends to be subtle, figuring out what you believe in or your ideologies as an adolescent. It's usually not front and center in a person's mind, but it does occur. So, for example, the issue of sex before marriage or living with somebody before marriage or a person's religious perspective. These are things that will be part of their identity that they have to figure out on their own. Most young people in Western societies like ours go through all of the explorations of psychosocial moratorium and then eventually, hopefully, start to commit. They start to make various commitments to what they're going to be like as an adult. So they do this regarding intimate relationships. They go through the psychosocial moratorium regarding their work. For example, because of my work, I often see students trying different courses in college or university to see where their interests lie and then completely changing their interests at some point. So this is, I hate the term normal because it's such a loaded term, but this really is normal. For example, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Nipissing, we have a lot of education students because we also have a teachers college. And at Nipissing, education students are known affectionately as Eddies. So we have a lot of Eddies. And and we have 2 sociology for educators course in the sociology department. I teach both courses and have for years. Every year at some point during both courses, I talk to them about what they can do with their education degree that doesn't involve actually teaching. And every year I have some students who talk to me after class about how from the time they were young, they were certain they always wanted to be a teacher. But after having so many placements in school practice teaching, they have realized it's not for them and they don't want to teach at all. They are planning to do something else. And as I said, they do this regarding what their preferred ideologies will be as they enter adulthood. And this sounds like a pretty direct process, and I'm sure for some people it is. But I think for a, a lot of people, it's not. I mean, I certainly remember feeling that way. I have very, very distinct memories of being stressed out, trying to figure out what to do after high school. And my educational path shows this. When I was in high school, we had grade 13, and I finished grade 12, but I quit grade 13. Really popular decision since both my parents were teachers. I took 1 year of general arts at college, thinking it would help me figure out what to do, then 2 years of social work at college. Then I transferred to university. At the end of university, I had to figure it out again. What do I do now? At the end of graduate school, what do I do now? And I can see a lot of younger friends or the children of my friends who are going through the same thing. excuse excuse me. It can be very, very overwhelming. It's like being the last kid in your class to have their growth spurt, the last girl to get your period, or the last boy to gain some height. You feel like you're always rushing to play catch up with everybody else. And you feel a real sense of incompetence, don't you? Because you just can't seem to figure things out and stabilize yourself. Now, according to Erikson, not only is successfully completing this developmental hump of identity versus identity confusion important for obvious reasons, it's also important because, like I said, completing this developmental hump is like the building block. It's a necessary step for further development. So if an adolescent has difficulty with identity formation, that might be something that contributes to a problem for them for the rest of their life. Doesn't mean that they're going to be a total mess, but it does mean they might have real difficulty. An extreme result of this would be developing a negative identity, an identity based on what a person has seen portrayed as most undesirable or dangerous. So this could be really extreme, or it could be in a much more mild way. A negative identity either can mean they're still kind of struggling to find themselves, so to speak. Maybe you know some people like this or who have these tendencies. You would describe them as seeming to have not much of an idea of where they're going in life. They just kind of bumble around from job to job. Maybe they're a career student, constantly taking out student loans to enroll in one program after another with no real end goal in mind. They seem to lack the ability to make any kind of definitive choice regarding school or work or personal relationships that would lead to a more settled future, or at least a more stable future. Not necessarily a perfect goal, not necessarily some kind of cookie cutter idea about what everybody's adult life should be like. I mean, they kind of wander in important ways when most people do not once they reach adulthood. A negative identity could develop because maybe an adolescent feels like the person their parents expect them to be is impossible for them or someone they simply don't want to be. So they take on a negative identity. So mom and dad expect me to be very, very studious and spend several hours every day doing extra homework outside of school. I have no interest in being that kind of person, so I'm going to be a party animal and purposely flunk out of school. A negative identity is associated with a person who turns to negative activities like crime or drugs. And you'll often hear this kind of reasoning in research regarding gang activities, looking at how or why young people join a gang. You could also argue that in neighborhoods with a lot of gang activity, those young people face obstacles that may actually prevent the development of a strong, healthy identity instead of a negative identity. Now, somebody who was significantly influenced by Erikson's work and who kind of built on it was a man named James Marcia. Here he is, looks like a happy guy. He also studied identity formation in adolescence, and he created something called the Identity Status Interview. So what Marcia did was he said there's four basic models of identity exploration that adolescents go through. And I want you to take note of the term that James Marcia does not use the term identity crisis. He uses the term identity exploration. And he did this purposely because he said that if you use the word crisis, this gives the impression automatically that identity development has to involve anguish and struggle. And does it for some people? Yes, but it doesn't involve it for everybody. So you could say that switching out the word crisis for exploration is a little more inclusive in a way. So, what does Marcia say? Well, remember, each stage involves exploration and commitment. He said one stage is identity diffusion. And in this stage, a young person is not exploring their identity at all. And because of this, they've made no commitment at all. So they're really not doing much. They're not exploring different alternatives. They're not thinking about things. They're not sorting through choices. And they're also not committing to anything. They don't really have any endpoint in mind. They don't have any goals in mind. So as I just said, somebody who just kind of stumbled their way through high school and graduated. They've got no idea what to do next. Haven't really thought about what to do next. Haven't thought to apply to colleges or universities or trade schools or vocational schools. You know, they've got a part-time job that gives them a little bit of spunny money, keep living with their parents. And when you ask them what they want to do, you get kind of the standard, I don't know. That's what Marcia says is identity diffusion in terms of figuring out an identity. An identity moratorium, an adolescent in this stage is looking around. They are exploring different choices. They're thinking about things, but they haven't committed to any of them yet. So this is not negative. They're actively trying on different identities. They're thinking about different identities, exploring their options. Maybe they're exploring different courses, different majors, different jobs. So lots of exploration, which is great, but very little commitment. This really is kind of a stereotypical youth identity crisis most people think of, isn't it? They're not committing to anything. They almost seem overwhelmed with all of the choices they have before them. Another stage is identity foreclosure. If you think there's a foreclosure, what does it mean? It means a house has been shut down. A young person in identity foreclosure does not experiment with a range of possibilities. They're not exploring their options. They just commit. So stereotypically, this is the adolescent who's just doing what they've been told. Their parents have kind of set them on a path and said, this is what you're doing. And the kid says, okay. And they're not going to argue about it, and they're not going to explore any other options. They don't really think for themselves and come to their own conclusions. And because of this, identity foreclosure really is viewed as unhealthy. Is it great that they're going to make a commitment? Yes. But exploration or questioning before a commitment, being sure of a commitment before you make it, is necessary for that commitment to be healthy. So imagine a 17-year-old girl in her last year of high school who only applies to the same university that her parents and grandparents went to, only applies to their teaching program because that's what her parents and grandparents did, and she knows that she's expected to also go into teaching because that's what her family does. She doesn't explore any other alternatives, and she doesn't really question if she might be more interested in anything else. Stage 4 of the identity status model is identity achievement. Yay, we've made it. So adolescents in this stage have a high degree of exploration and a high degree of commitment. Ideally, this is what we want everybody to do. They have really actively explored school, education, religious beliefs, values, interests, all of it. They've really explored the options they have in life, and then they've come to a conclusion. After doing all their research, they've made a commitment. They've made definite personal choices, choices regarding education and all of it. In a perfect world, this is what every adolescent would go through. So James Marcia says we've got these 4 processes for an adolescent regarding their identity. And remember, they won't necessarily go through all 4. But of course, any theory or textbook about theory would not be complete without considering what holes other people have poked in that theory. You know, being an academic or a theorist is similar to being a parent of a teenager, because no matter what you say, somebody else is always going to respond by arguing with you. So in general, as your textbook points out, although Erikson was and still is a dominant force in identity theory, followed by a lot of support by James Marcia, these days, more modern identity theory is not quite as regimented. It's not quite as precise. This is called postmodern identity. And all this says is, you know what? Identities are much more complex than we've ever realized in the past. And in addition, identities are not concrete. Identities are fluid, and they can be really fluid. So at every part of your life, including adolescence, a postmodern identity perspective says that a person's identity at any particular time, in any particular context, is going to change. And that doesn't mean they're being wishy-washy. It's just, I guess you could say it's human nature, for lack of a better term. So to put it in a simpler way, a postmodern perspective of identity says that a person's self does not maintain an absolutely stable core of identity. Instead, it's fluid. This reminds me of the idea of a person having different selves and sometimes purposely presenting a false self in certain situations or certain contexts. And I mean, and it's up to you how you view this, which one you think is more accurate. Now, the more rigid identity theories, such as Erikson and Marcia, have also been criticized in regards to gender, and they've also been criticized in regards to ethnicity. So again, it's up to you which perspective you think is correct, or maybe it's like a buffet and you pick and choose from each one of them. And the textbook goes into much more detail in this regard, looking at specifically at criticisms of these theories. So we've covered a lot in this chapter, and there's a little more in the textbook that you are responsible for as well. Remember that unless I specifically state something's not included, whether I make specific reference to it or not in my lectures, you are responsible for it. To summarize very generally how the self develops during adolescence, remember at the very basis of it, an adolescent's thinking becomes more abstract and more complex, which leads the self to develop in ways it simply could not before during childhood. You have an ideal self, a false self, a feared self, in addition to who you actually are. This is going to affect your baseline self-esteem and your barometric self-esteem. And this will all be directly affected by what kind of culture you live in, whether it's individualistic or collectivistic. And it's going to be affected by your gender and ethnicity. Things do begin to even out in emerging adulthood. They're not perfect, but they do settle down at least a bit for most people. We do also have specific theories regarding identity development in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Erik Erikson's idea of a developmental crisis at each stage of life that we hope will result in a stable identity, or sometimes it results in identity confusion. And James Marcia built on this with his identity status model, softening the approach and using the term exploration instead of crisis. So I hope everything has been clear for you. Remember, if it hasn't, you can always email me with questions and I'll get back to you quickly. And please do not forget to do your quiz for this week.